Welcome to the Lynn Hall Library. I'm Julie Andrews, the director here. Thank you for joining us tonight for the final event of the Origins and Legacies, the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, a project developed by the Lynn Hall to mark the 25th anniversary of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. On this, the anniversary of the referendum, Professor Jon Tonge and Suzanne Breen will discuss the history of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement and its referendum, and a number of live polls will run during the event, which you'll be given a bit of instruction on shortly. Thank you to the National Lottery Heritage Fund for supporting this project. We have our exhibition running until the end of May. And please return, if you haven't had an opportunity to do so, to come back and look at it again in more detail. Again, I would like to thank tonight Melissa Bird, the project lead, and Annie and Samantha for their support with her on the project. So thank you very much. I'm now going to hand over to Jon and Suzanne.
Thank you very much. Thanks everyone for coming, and thank you to Lynn Hall for the invitation and for such a splendid series. What I want to do is transport you back to April and May 1998 to look at the Good Friday Agreement referendum campaign. What were the key issues? Why did people vote the way they did? And was there any nervousness in terms of the Yes campaign as that campaign unfolded? And then Suzanne will be bringing us up to date, looking at contemporary attitudes to the Good Friday Agreement. So there we are. In terms of the data, sorry, just to go back one step, in terms of the data, there's a limited amount of data that we have on the Good Friday Agreement referendum. Most of the data that I'll use, unless I say otherwise, will be from the Northern Ireland 1998 referendum study, which was conducted by Queen's, Strathclyde and Oxford universities. It was quite an extensive study, so we're hoping that the data is or was reliable. We know the basics. Everyone in this room will be familiar with the basics, the resounding endorsement in many ways of the Good Friday Agreement. 71% yes vote, 28.9% no vote on a massive turnout, 81%. It just shows how constitutional issues can get people out. You know, if you think about the Scottish independence referendum as well, 84% turnout for that. Turnout is generally a point I've been boring people with over the last few days in terms of the local elections. Turnouts are good here. In the city in which I work, turnout was 28% for the local elections. So take a bow, the 56% of you who voted in Thursday's contest. And then south of the border, you see turnout obviously much more modest, slightly differently framed referendum to revise Articles 2 and 3 of the Constitution, but a very, very extensive yes vote there. So we're concentrating on the referendum in the north, and here it wasn't broken down. The Northern Ireland Referendum Survey used the Catholic-Protestant divide, and what they found was a really, really, really emphatic yes vote on the Catholic side, 99% voting yes. Protestants, as had been anticipated, more of which in a moment, more evenly divided, 57% to 43%, tight. How much it mattered that you had cross-community support is open to question. It was an overall majority and in that sense it was a binary referendum, but clearly in terms of legitimacy it was crucial in that sense politically that there be a majority on the Protestant side. And then amongst those who say they were neither Catholic nor Protestant, smaller number back in 1998, again very extensive endorsement there. How much did the campaign actually shape the referendum that we're celebrating 25 years on today? In terms of those who voted yes but considered voting no, a small percentage did on the Catholic side, but not many. A more significant minority on the Protestant side voted yes but had considered voting no during the campaign. And then amongst the others, those neither Catholic nor Protestant or of no religion, quite a significant number in one sense were affected by the campaign. They did vote yes, but had considered voting no. Then, okay, so that's how public opinion shaped up in terms of the traditional binary divide. There were a number of hurdles to cross within the parties that we tend to sometimes overlook when we look at the public referendum. The UUP executive, the day after the Good Friday Agreement, voted 55-23 in favour of the deal. It's worth pointing out that David Trimble didn't have a majority of his own Westminster MPs. 6 out of the 10 UUP MPs at the time were against the Good Friday Agreement. So David Trimble had to do a lot of work within his own party to an extent that other political leaders simply didn't, and a bit more of that later. Then the UUP Council, which in many ways is the decision-making body of or the ultimate sovereign decision-making body within the Ulster Unionist Party, voted substantially but not overwhelmingly in favour of the deal. And then the following month you had the Sinn Féin. It was the second Ardèche of that year, 331 of 350 Sinn Féin delegates. I remember being sat as an observer in that. It was a show of hands. They did have counters on, and 331 out of 350 Sinn Féin delegates voted in favour at that Ardèche. That was the one that was marked by the Balcombe Street. Those people who were due to be released under the terms of the Good Friday Agreement were paraded on the platform at that Ardèche. How was public opinion going during the campaign then? Well, the only regular set of same-size opinion polls that were conducted during that campaign were by the Irish Times. And it looked a walk in the park, frankly, the referendum, if you look at the polling at the start of the campaign. The 15th of April Irish Times reported an 84%, there would be an 84% yes vote. That's what the Irish Times said on the 15th of April. But by the 13th of May, the Irish Times was reporting only two-thirds, only 66% would vote yes in the Good Friday Agreement referendum. And the Irish Times were reporting in that poll that there was a clear majority of Unionists who now opposed the Good Friday Agreement. And that did set alarm bells ringing. How much it contributed to the famous Trimble, Hume, Bono moment, we don't know. One of the myths that has developed about the referendum campaign, and I once said this wrongly in lecture, is that actually harmed the campaign and the support for the agreement went down after that night. It didn't actually. It went because on the eve of the referendum, the Irish Times reported that support was back up, not to the level of the 15th of April, but it was back up to 71% and 29% of the population opposed it. Congratulations to the Irish Times, because that was a perfect poll. It was exactly, they forecast it exactly. Their eve of poll reporting was spot on. And what they found was that whilst Unionists were still pretty evenly divided on the agreement, there had been some shoring up of Unionist support, which was, during the campaign, was slipping quite substantially. So, what was going on? Well, the support for the aspects of the Good Friday Agreement, I hope you can all see those figures. Let's pick out, rather than go through the whole lot, but let's see what was concerning Protestant no voters. And again, you know, this is based on the survey. They use the term Protestant rather than Unionist. So the power sharing executive, frankly, those Protestant section of the Protestant community that didn't want the deal, they didn't like the idea of power sharing. A majority of them were opposed. It's fair to say, you know, 48% even of those who voted no, or said they were going to vote no, or said they had voted no, to be correct, you know, they 48% were in favour of power sharing, but there wasn't majority support amongst Protestant no voters. In terms of north-south bodies, they were a big no-no, even though you could argue that north-south bodies were not particularly significant, that those that were set up. We can debate that, but you see only 24% of no voters were prepared to accept them. They were strongly opposed to them. And then going down again on the right-hand side, if we go towards the bottom, there weren't many those who rejected the Good Friday Agreement. They didn't see it as a route to economic prosperity, whereas you see quite clearly amongst Unionists, Protestants, we're using it interchangeably, amongst Protestants, clearly they did think this was a route to economic prosperity. They did think the political deadlock had been broken, whereas on the no side, you know, political deadlock hasn't been broken. And what I think is striking is at the bottom, the scepticism. You know, people think there was... I talked to students, you know, my students were born, how old? 18, what's 18 years from 2023? When were they born? 25, so obviously they were born long after this. They seem to think there was some sort of easy route towards peace and selling the deal. On both, whether you were a yes or a no voter, on the Protestant side, there was scepticism as to whether the deal would lead to a lasting peace. So, in many ways, it's pretty brave, you know, backing the deal, even though you don't think it's going to lead to a lasting peace. I think that's quite a striking statistic on the yes side. Because 99% of Catholics voted yes, the numbers will be too low to break it into yes and no voters. So here the referendum study used the division between those Catholics who identified as nationalist and those who identified as Republican to look at their views on the deal. So these people are all overwhelmingly voting yes, okay, whether you identify as a nationalist or whether you identify as a Republican. But there were a few concerns on the Republican side. There was resistance to the idea of decommissioning before entering government. And Republicans won that argument. Initially, the British government wanted prior decommissioning. Senator Mitchell recommended parallel decommissioning in parallel with the talks. In the end, as we know, decommissioning was fudged. The famous letter from Tony Blair saying, as far as he was concerned, decommissioning was a requirement of the deal. But it wasn't actually. All the agreement actually says is it calls upon the parties to use the maximum influence they can to achieve decommissioning. And we know that the IRA didn't fully decommission until 2005. So that Republican concern was addressed by a fudging of the deal. And then in terms of the removal of Ireland's constitutional claim to the North, again, Republicans didn't like that. At that Sinn Féin Ardèche that I mentioned, this formed quite a bit of the discussion, as I recall. I went through my notes again for this talk. Some Republicans got up on the platform and said, well, it was worthless anyway. The Irish government's never attempted to exercise it, so it doesn't matter. Others felt it was still of great symbolic importance and didn't want to let go of it. So it did prompt quite a discussion within Sinn Féin. In terms of leading to a lasting peace, again, only 39% of Republicans felt it would lead to a lasting peace. So again, one of the few things that Republicans and no voters on the unionist side might have agreed with was scepticism over whether it was going to lead to a lasting peace. So in terms of carrying their sides, I think the most important, this is arguably the most important slide of all, because the level of trust, there's two particular figures I want to pick out here. Okay? Look at the percentage of nationalists who place faith in David Trimble here. Very high. There's a big belief in the capacity of David Trimble to deliver his side. You want to use those terms. Belief that Trimble is steering the Ulster Unionist Party in a markedly different direction. And then, if you look at Protestant yes voters, yeah, they back Hume. Not overwhelmingly, but they think, they trust John Hume in terms of his delivery of the deal. But still, if you look at some of the other figures, they are pretty emphatic. Protestant no voters' trust in Gerry Adams was fairly emphatic at 0%. And Republican trust in Ian Paisley, there's plenty of reciprocation there. So, the roles of Trimble and Hume are crucial in that respect. You see the influence, obviously, as you'd expect of Ian Paisley, Protestant no voters, but look at the rejection of Paisley, the lack of trust in Paisley amongst those Protestants who voted yes to the deal. So I think these figures are pretty striking in what they convey about who was trusted to actually deliver the Good Friday Agreement. In terms of who it benefited more, the Northern Life and Times survey, been running annually, I think, since 1998. And this has been sort of part of the problem when the agreement has hit trouble, I think, is that the perception has been, amongst Catholics, that everyone benefits equally. That prevails less amongst Protestants, okay? So there's a perceived asymmetry at times in terms of who has benefited from the Good Friday Agreement. In terms of what happened next, well, Suzanne's going to take over any second now, but one last anniversary is that next month we'll be celebrating the 25th anniversary of the first elections to the new Assembly. And you could see that there were going to be difficulties ahead, because if you look at the anti-agreement unionists, they were nearly as numerical as the pro-Good Friday Agreement unionists within 2 months of the deal being signed. So it was obvious that this deal might not live happily ever after, but we're here celebrating it 25 years on. So it shows its capacity to endure and survive despite what has been thrown at it. Suzanne is now going to bring you up to date with the contemporary story.
Okay, well, first of all, thanks to the Linen Hall for giving me a nice orange mic here. Alan down there takes responsibility. I've been getting a wee bit of grief in recent weeks for my coverage in the Belfast Telegraph by the DUP. So if Dundela Avenue is watching, here you are, lads, here it is. John's better organised than I am. He's got slides. I can't use the excuses of the council elections as a reason for not having them because he was as busy as I was. So you'll have to bear with me. I have notes. And all the stats that I'm using are from Lucid Talk polls, most from the Belfast Telegraph, one from the Sunday Times, but they're all from Bill White and Lucid Talk. And in January, coming up to the anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, we asked people, how would you vote if there was a referendum tomorrow? And 64% of people said they would vote yes, and 31% said no. 5% were undecided. Now, 64% is a good showing by anybody's books, but clearly there has been some slippage. That's 7 percentage points down from 1998. And the drop in support has not been on the nationalist side, people who vote Sinn Féin or SDLP, or on the other side of the House, people who are Alliance voters or Green voters. The slip has been completely on the Unionist side, and a majority of Unionists say that they would now vote against the Good Friday Agreement if a referendum was held tomorrow. Just 1 in 3 would endorse the deal. 95% of nationalists said they would vote yes. Even more Alliance Green supporters, 96% of them, but just 35% of people who vote for Unionist parties say that they would endorse the agreement if they had to go to the polls tomorrow. So the DUP led the campaign against the Good Friday Agreement, and it's not really surprising that their voters, or the TUV didn't exist then, but it isn't surprising that people who now vote for Jim Allister's party would not support the agreement. But where there has been change is among those who voted for the Ulster Unionists. David Trimble obviously backed the agreement, was a key Unionist player at the time, and 80% of Ulster Unionists in 1998, 80% of people who voted for the UUP supported the deal. Just 58% of them would do so now. And looking away from the party political differences, there are big gender divisions too. 3/4 of women would vote yes if there was a referendum tomorrow, but just over half of men would support the deal, and twice as many men as women say they would vote against the agreement. And we found as well that opposition also increased with age. The over 65s were less enthusiastic about the peace accord. 59% of them said that they would vote yes, but among 18 to 24-year-olds, 64% said they'd endorse it. But we'll have to be a wee bit careful here because in some ways that's due to demographic trends. You will find that there are more Unionist voters in the older age groups, and obviously there's more nationalists and other voters among the younger population. So if there was a referendum tomorrow, yes would win, and it would win well. And the count wouldn't be on a knife edge. We wouldn't all be kind of wondering how will it go. But that's not the point. Securing a majority in both communities was always regarded by both London and Dublin as essential in giving the Good Friday Agreement legitimacy. And in the final episode of Derry Girls, it shows all the characters going into polling booths in May 1998. And every single one of them votes yes. And that is an accurate reflection of the nationalist community. But if that sitcom had been in a state school, if it had been in Londonderry High instead of Our Lady Immaculate College, the result would have been very different, as John has outlined. It was always a much harder sell on the Unionist side of the House than on the nationalist side of the House. And even though the UUP did sign up, it didn't really actively get out there and sell the deal, whereas the SDLP and Sinn Féin did. And there were some dissident Republicans that were opposed to the deal. There was obviously as well people on the left, people like Eamon McCann, who thought it institutionalised sectarianism. But opposition from within the nationalist community was always a minority sport. And I suppose if I'm looking at it now, I do find the unionist position a wee bit puzzling in terms of the drift away from supporting the agreement, because the issues which drove unionist opposition 25 years ago aren't really relevant now. There were very emotive subjects like prisoner releases and the commission that was set up, the Patent Commission, to look at the future of the RUC and decommissioning. But in prisoner releases, well, everybody would have been out anyway, even if it wasn't for the Good Friday Agreement. I think everybody would have probably, all the prisoners would have been out by 2010. So people as well, they voted to free loyalist prisoners, not just Republican ones. In terms of the RUC, well, it became the PSNI and the world didn't fall in. It's not a Republican police service. Indeed, it has, remained a majority of Protestants within the PSNI, and we have seen 50-50 recruitment abandoned. In terms of the lack of IRA decommissioning, that did do an awful lot of harm to unionist support for the agreement. It didn't happen until 2005, so it was belated. But even during the period that the IRA kept their guns, they didn't go back to war in the sense that they had been. Their weapons weren't targeted at security forces, they weren't targeted at loyalists. It was actually working class nationalists that died in that period. There was direct action against drugs, which killed drug dealers or alleged drug dealers. And there were people like Andrew Kearney. He was a nationalist shot dead in New Lodge by the IRA just a few months after the Good Friday Agreement. We saw Robert McCartney's killing in 2005 by Sinn Féin and IRA members. Obviously no guns were used, but he was stabbed to death. And we later saw the murder of Paul Quinn in 2007. He was brutally beaten to death just across the border by IRA members in South Armagh. So the whole issue of decommissioning and IRA activity shouldn't really affect unionist support now, and the IRA might not have completely gone away in every technical sense of the word, but they certainly don't pose a violent threat to the state anymore. And, there were very strong voices on the Republican side of the House at the time in 1998 who were disillusioned with the Good Friday Agreement. Brendan Hughes, who was a former IRA commander in Belfast, he said that the Good Friday Agreement stood for "got fuck all." And we have, today there are people like Anthony McIntyre, who was an IRA prisoner. He served about 20 years in prison, and I interviewed him for the anniversary of the agreement, and he talked about all the major compromises that Republicans made. He said Republicans were present at the negotiations, but Republicanism wasn't. A United Ireland wasn't on the agenda. And he said Good Friday and Easter Sunday, they're just 2 days apart, but the gap between Good Friday Republicans and Easter Sunday Republicans is light years. And he also pointed to the fact that when it comes to a border poll, the clause in the Good Friday Agreement is actually quite weak. It is up to a Secretary of State, someone who doesn't have a single vote here, in Northern Ireland to decide if there is going to be a border poll or not. So I think in some ways that there are many reasons for nationalist Republicans to be disillusioned with the Good Friday Agreement. At the time, I remember Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness, they didn't say that the agreement would in itself deliver Irish unity, but they did say that it would be the start of the process. And I remember countless times they talked about a united Ireland by 2016. And just today, Boyle Sports have changed the odds following Sinn Féin being the largest nationalist party on the councils. They've changed the odds for a border poll by 2030. And the odds are now evens. They had been 2-1, but they put the chances of a border poll being won by nationalists as very unlikely. 5-2 in favour of Irish unity compared to 2-7 against people here voting to keep the constitutional status quo. So there are other things too. Articles 2 and 3 of the Irish Constitution were removed after the Good Friday Agreement, and the much vaunted Irish dimension didn't really amount to much. The North-South Ministerial Council, like the power-sharing institutions, hasn't been operating for most of the time, and cross-border bodies that some maybe saw as a stepping stone to Irish unity were fairly toothless. And if we're looking at other voters too, they would have reason to be disappointed, because all the progressive moves that have happened in Northern Ireland in terms of same-sex marriage, in terms of abortion reform, they've all come from Westminster and not from Stormont. Yet support for the agreement among nationalists and among other voters remains sky high. And I think that's because it's not maybe about the technicalities of the deal, it's that the agreement is seen as a symbolic turning point for Northern Ireland when it changed from being an exclusively unionist state to one which potentially offered recognition of both traditions and parity of esteem. Now, unionist disillusionment, I think, with the institutions, it's very much tied up with demographics and electoral results, because the unionist majority in Stormont has gone. And I think unionists are very uneasy about that, and they don't find Stormont the comfortable place that it once was. A lucid talk poll for the Belfast Telegraph suggesting that Stormont rules should be changed to stop one party having a veto on the institution's functioning found that 2/3 of people in Northern Ireland, 2/3 of voters, thought that the rules should be changed. And Alliance voters were the keenest for rule change, not surprisingly, because they are the people who suffer most from the current status quo. 97% of Alliance voters wanted the rules to be changed to stop a unionist or a nationalist party having a veto and effectively crashing the institutions. 92% of SDLP voters wanted the rules changed. And this is one, I think, that is noteworthy. 83% of Sinn Féin voters wanted the rules changed. So Sinn Féin voters actually are in favour of removing a veto for their own party. Sinn Féin isn't, but their voters are. When we look at unionists, there is a wee bit of a split. 69% of Ulster unionists want the rules changed, but it's the opposite for the DUP and the TUV. 70% of DUP voters and 72% of TUV voters quite like the fact that there is a veto, even though that veto can be used just as much by Sinn Féin as the DUP. So, just kind of getting near the end here, I think recent polling reinforces that the Good Friday Agreement did not lead to reconciliation between both traditions. Quite the opposite. And what we find is that growing unionist antipathy for the agreement actually reinforces nationalist affection for it, and vice versa. And this happens so often in Northern Ireland. People aren't judging things in terms of reading documents or actually measuring concrete progress. It's just if one side thinks it's good, then the other side says it's bad, and vice versa. So there's been very little thawing in terms of community relations since the Good Friday Agreement. We still have segregated housing, we have segregated education, and I think the agreement has been a lot of the time really about managing division, not about ending it. And in terms of unionist feelings, you know, we saw a trail of political VIPs over the last few weeks coming to Northern Ireland, Bill and Hillary Clinton, Tony Blair, President Biden, and selling the merits of the Good Friday Agreement. But that's not going to convince those unionists. In fact, again, it's probably only going to reinforce them in their opposition, to have the opposite effect. Now, what I think goes to the heart of unionist opposition now to the agreement is what we have seen with the whole protocol debate. And the protocol features really, really strongly in unionist feeling against the peace deal, because the agreement was successfully employed as a reason to avoid a land border on the island of Ireland, but it wasn't successfully used in order to stop an Irish sea border. And I think this has rekindled and strengthened unionist opposition. But again, it's not really about the document, it's about demographics and voting trends and the fact that Sinn Féin is now the biggest party in Stormont. And when the institutions are restored, and I think they will be in the autumn, it'll be Michelle O'Neill who takes that job as First Minister. Now, none of that was envisaged in 1998, even by the doomsday merchants. I don't recall Ian Paisley or Bob McCartney or those who led the unionist campaign against the agreement saying that. I mean, I don't even know if a SDLP First Minister was considered, let alone a Sinn Féin one. So I think unionists feel that the direction of political and demographic travel has been all against them, and they're suspicious about the change in Northern Ireland, and they feel that they have lost and they have gained nothing. I don't think that's accurate. I think that they have gained quite a lot, but they can't recognise it. And the whole Sinn Féin campaign in the local government elections, it was all about getting the institutions up and running and getting Northern Ireland moving again. And I think when you've got a Republican Party that is as keen as mustard to get Stormont back, that's a really, really big win. And unionists just need to take the blinkers off and open their eyes and see that.
We're going to move now to the live polling section. So if you haven't voted enough in the last week, you're about to. So on the way in, you will have all been given a keypad. Does anyone not have one? The question is, in the 1998 referendum, did you support, or if you weren't able to vote at the time, would you have supported the Belfast Good Friday Agreement? And again, it's 1 for yes and 2 for no. Okay? So it's 80% would have or did vote yes and 20% no. And then our second question is, if a referendum on the Belfast Good Friday Agreement was held tomorrow, would you vote to support it? So again, it's 1 for yes, you would support it, or 2, no, you would not support it. So I'll vote no. Has everyone voted okay? It should come up on the keypad. Yeah. I think there might be a few abstentions in this one. Oh. Quite like. So 79% yes and 21% no. And then the final question for this evening is, Do you think the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland should call a border poll within the next 5 years? And again, it's 1 for yes and 2 for no. Everybody ready?
We're going to move to Q&A, basically, either on anything we've said or on any of those 3 poll results. I think I'm in favour of a border poll, if only for the lucrative media work.
I love them too as well. Do you know, it's my kind of desire just before I retire in 10 or 15 years, whenever that is, that I'll get to cover a border poll.
So fire away with the questions anyway.
I don't see any point in having a border poll unless you know what you're voting for. I mean, if anything, Brexit should have made that abundantly clear to anybody that you've got to have clear definition of what you're getting or not getting before you have a poll.
Okay, I thought it was an excellent idea of Suzanne's to include that question. We did box and cox a bit about what the time frame should be in terms of should it be next 5 years or next 10 years. I think it would have been quite interesting actually to see whether more people would have supported that idea in 10 years when there could potentially be more time to frame a prospectus. There's no guarantee, of course, that a prospectus would necessarily be approved. I mean, thinking back to the Scottish independence campaign, the prospectus from the SNP was very long, 670 pages. It was a huge document, but they didn't get that over the line. But yeah, I mean, you know, the morning after Brexit, after the Brexit vote, yeah, we all know how we felt in terms of what happens next. So undoubtedly, whichever side of the border poll argument you're on, I mean, if one does go ahead, there needs to be a clear plan for what a united Ireland would look like. I think that the problem with that is that unionists have said they're not going to engage in that conversation. I mean, with the exception of a few unionists, Peter Robinson has indicated that he would, but most have said they don't want to engage. I remember hearing Steve Aitken, when he was leader of the UUP, say, why would I preside in a discussion over the dissolution of my own country? So it's going to be difficult to frame it in a way that would engage unionists. That attitude might change over the next few years, I'm not sure.
I think a lot of it is, it's up to those who want a border poll, it's up to the nationalist parties and also the Dublin government to start putting kind of meat on the bones and really fleshing out what Irish unity would look like. I don't think there's going to be a queue of unionists looking to join the conversation. It doesn't make sense. Why should they? But they will have to obviously take part in the discussion if a border poll is called. It's interesting, I'm just looking at stats from a Lucid Talk poll for the Sunday Times from last August, and you tonight, you're both more in favour of a border poll, this audience in the Linen Hall, and also more against one. That's really, really strange. So Lucid Talk asked, should there be a border poll within the next 5 years? 36% of people said yes. 29% said yes, but not in 5 years. And 31% said no, not at all. So there's both more people here completely opposed to a border poll and also more here that want one and want one soon.
Thanks. My question's about the fact that there were 2 different referenda in 1998, one in the north and one in the south, and we often hear Republicans criticising that and saying actually the southern vote wasn't a mandate for the agreement, but I'm really curious to know what your thoughts on that are, and do you think it matters that the referenda were on 2 different things?
Okay, to reply to what each one said. Yeah, I mean, it's a good point. I mean, it was very specific, the referendum in the south. It was on the revision to Articles 2 and 3, in line with every other constitutional amendment in the south. There has to be a referendum on it, so there was no alternative other than to frame it in those terms. to pick out the constitutional amendments from the Good Friday Agreement and vote on it in that way. I was surprised the turnout was so low in the south. I mean, I do think, you know, it was a pretty, people just didn't bother turning out. 55% is actually pretty low on that. But I don't think the actual referendum could have been framed in any other way than the way it was. Yeah.
It's a technical point for Republicans, but I don't think it's one that really is hugely relevant to the political debate now. I mean, the whole argument that the Irish people should be able to vote as a whole for their future with exactly the same question asked. But then there are Republicans who believe that the Irish people shouldn't have to vote at all, that basically the Republic has already been declared and it's just up to Britain to politically leave Ireland. So I don't think there's still some Republicans, I think it's the 1916 societies, who would argue against a future border poll. But I think for the majority in the nationalist and Republican community, they do accept the votes in the Good Friday Agreement in the different jurisdictions, and do accept the setup of a border poll and when one will take place.
I'd agree. Just one last thing on that. It wasn't self-determination, if you want to go that. It was co-determination, you know. But that's not bad.
Yeah, thanks. With regard to that border poll question, the key danger for unionists is that I think you will both know presumably that it says that if the Secretary of State believes from other bits of information he has that there's a possibility of a majority in favour of a change of the status, he can call the border poll, and that's okay. The drawback from a unionist point of view is, as I remember, is once you have one border poll, you must continue to have them every 7 years. And that's a great danger, because we'll just sit back as a unionist. We'll win the first one, and we'll spend the next 6 or 7 years fighting to make sure we win the next, and the nationalists will spend the next 6 or 7 years building to win the next one. And it'll actually put the border in the front burner that it never has been in my lifetime.
Come back quickly on that. Yeah, I mean, first of all, yeah, you're right. It is within the sole power of the Secretary of State, described as a he, even though it was a woman Secretary of State in 1998. It doesn't have to be another referendum every 7 years, but it is almost inevitable, because if the criteria are just to have been met in, let's say, 2028, it's very unlikely the criteria would have disappeared by 2035, assuming the first border poll is lost. So we would be in never-ending land until the referendum is won, and then presumably that's it. I mean, that will be the last one. That, you know, some unionists are already getting aggrieved over that, but that's what was agreed in the Good Friday Agreement, yeah.
I was taking, Suzanne, your quite correct comment that while there hasn't been any return to violence, and there won't be, though of course the government's licensed the UVF to shoot prods and the IRA to shoot Catholics for quite a while after the agreement. As a psychiatrist in West Belfast, I remember meeting Gerry Adams along with John Alderdice about January '95 after the first ceasefire, and saying, Gerry, none of my patients has been shot by the IRA in the last 4 months. On the other hand of it, quite a few had the legs broke with baseball bats, you know. And I was told, well, that's nothing to do with us family feuds. And then they started shooting, and with Jock Davidson did the first murder, as you know, and so on, to the government licence. But fascinatingly, the IRA thought a ceasefire meant they couldn't shoot anybody. And they didn't, to be fair to them. Didn't shoot anybody until the British government and the Irish government said it's okay, because the loyalists never stopped shooting working class Protestants, which is quite an interesting way of thinking about it, that the IRA thought a ceasefire meant a ceasefire, but an Irish ceasefire means you can shoot people of the same religion. My key point here, you made the point about reconciliation. While the violence has gone, almost certainly for good, reconciliation is nowhere near, not just the schools and the peace walls and the housing and the sports. looked at the election recently, and as a 45-year member of the Alliance Party, pleased to see the Alliance doing very well, although in 1977 at 14.4% of the vote. But I think it's catastrophic the UUs and SDLP have suffered so badly because there's no broad centre alternative to Sinn Féin DUP. And from 2001, clearly Sinn Féin overtook the SDLP, and by 2005 the DUP. And I think and that's really pretty bad. We're more polarised politically than we ever have been. And I think that is something. So I wonder, have you any thoughts as to why that has been as catastrophic for those two parties, given that Trimble and Hume, you say, had support from the other side of the House, or a lot of respect, why that's happened and the implications for the future?
I think Sinn Féin basically stole the SDLP's clothes, and we can very much see that in terms of the Sinn Féin response to the Queen's death and to King Charles's coronation, where Mark Durkan was absolutely lambasted for going to the Queen Mother's funeral. Now it's regarded as a bold move, as a courageous move to do this, and people who are against it are branded anti-peace. In terms of unionism, I wouldn't say that the DUP has stolen the UUP's clothes, but it just seems to be that there has been a rightward drift, perhaps as well. When once Paisley got in there, he worked it actually quite well. It's been the problems with his successors that it has appeared to be begrudging on behalf of the DUP, particularly probably Arlene Foster. In your point in terms of the British government effectively given the thumbs up to a certain type of violence continuing, I completely and absolutely agree with that. And I know Mo Mowlam is hailed a lot for her role in the peace process, and she's elevated as a heroine. I think the mothers and the sisters and the wives of people who lost loved ones after the agreement wouldn't see it that way. I'm thinking of people here like Maureen Kearney, whose son Andy was killed. Mo Mowlam coined the phrase internal housekeeping when she was asked about continuing IRA violence, and you know it was putting some lives up on a pedestal compared to others, and it appeared to be at the time that if you were working class and Catholic and you were being shot by the IRA, it didn't really matter.
What I want to ask is, all the presidents coming from America over to here, and the amount of money that was spent on their security whenever there's people who are starving in Northern Ireland who have to go to food banks, and you know, and there's no politicians there to help them. There's kids who can't get a school, a special needs school, because there's no politicians to help with the Education Library Board. There's no school buses, there's no nothing for them. But for the basic people, that's their basic right, and all this amount of money was spent on security for them, where it could have been spent on their education or the health and well-being of nurses and stuff like that, and pay raises. I was just wondering what you think about that.
I think there was a big disconnect between the official Good Friday Agreement celebrations and the community. I do think that it was, you know, geared for the middle classes, and I don't think that ordinary people generally were as inspired. It did seem, particularly as we are in the middle of a very fierce cost of living crisis, to be in keeping with what was needed. But you know, I wouldn't say that. I would say probably I might be a minority voice in some in terms of the media and how and the response to it. But certainly I didn't think that it was appropriate. I also didn't think that it was fitting for Tony Blair to be hailed as a great peacemaker when he has the blood of so many civilians in Iraq on his hands. That was absolutely jarring.
was a very middle-class approach to the whole celebration of the Good Friday Agreement. I suppose if it had have been any other way and they had have gone out into the community, it would have exposed what it hadn't achieved in certain terms of social reform and housing, and that was something that they didn't want us to see or didn't want to be brought to the world stage.
There was a complete absence of community activists, people from the community sector there, and 100%. It did seem to be geared very much to 100%. Businesses and professionals.
I just want to come back to the last poll question there and just get your thoughts on, given the kind of intentional ambiguity that was built into criteria for calling a border poll with the Secretary of State, do you think there will be any move in the next few years to clarify what those criteria would be? Because not only would that maybe give a wee bit more clarity in the overall conversation, it might actually give a wee bit more impetus to the likes of the Irish government to start planning when they know when it's likely to be reached and when there might be an actual campaign starting.
I wish the criteria were clearer, but there's no chance of them being made so. The court was really, really emphatic in dismissing the cases that have been, the courts have dismissed the cases that were brought before it were. There was a demand for fixed criteria, whether it be vote shares, whether it be election results, whether it be opinion polls, whatever. And Mr. Justice Girvan in the High Court said it's purely a matter for the Secretary of State to decide what the criteria are. So the chances of us getting clear criteria at the moment look minimal. It will be a debate that will rumble on, for sure. And the more that Sinn Féin has soar away election successes, then for sure, people will say, well, you're ignoring these results. But at the moment, the chances of getting fixed criteria look very bleak.
And what are the dialogues that are being held in place in order to talk about the Good Friday Belfast Agreement, from moving it from the agree to disagree perspective to an engaging in restorational practice? Because what you have said, that there was restoration, that there was trying to keep taking people from the prison, try to bring people back together. It was more of a managing the problem than resolving the problem. And I'm seeing, for example, the international mural, that there are a lot of troubles or a lot of revolution drawn from outside, without a proper connotation to the history of it. For example, there is one of Nelson Mandela that did a restorational practice in South Africa, in which was trying to bring the people together without trying to point finger. Because from my perspective as a newly resident of Belfast, both parties had their wrongdoings in it, but I don't see none of the both parties accepting and acknowledging that they were also part of the problem, part of the conflict, and not trying to, because I believe only if you accept that you are also part of the problem, you can actively work on the resolution, actively ask for forgiveness, and to forgive the other. But that is not something I see. Is there any dialogues being held in place in order to have a referendum to make a conscious decision about what is the fate of Belfast?
Okay, I really like your phrase at the start where you said the Good Friday Agreement was about agreeing to disagree, because that's what it was. It was about managing division. It wasn't a deal based upon reconciliation. It was a deal very similar to the sort of deal you see in places like Bosnia, Lebanon, where it's about managing division. There's the hope that the divisions miraculously biodegrade somehow further down the track, which isn't going to happen without a programme for restoration and reintegration. The issue then is, well, okay, how do you develop that programme of integrating society? Who's going to be the first person to say, well, we'll bulldoze that peace wall, we'll take that down? Who's going to be the first person that's going to do that? Which party on the executive? If you look at the work of Cathy Gorman-Heenan and Johnny Byrne at Ulster, University of Ulster, they found that the closer the people lived to peace walls, the more they still wanted them up. So what do you do about that? So it's fine. We're all in favour of integration. And then in terms of, community autonomy was a big feature of a deal like the Good Friday Agreement as well. So then there's people say everyone should go to the same schools, integrated education. And there should be equal provision for integrated education. I suppose the question then begged would be, will everyone take it up? Opinion polls suggest that people will, but there's absolutely no guarantee of that. So there are difficult questions about how you reintegrate a society that haven't, to be honest, we're still in the starting stalls in terms of how they're addressed, because there's never been a big programme of reintegration ever attempted, because the executive has kept collapsing anyway.
Actually, I am part of that, one of those programs. I'm from the Netherlands. I just moved here. In Ireland, I'm an artist educator, and we are trying to create a socially engaged art in which we try to combine the history of both parties, actually all three parties, the Protestants, the Catholic, and nationalist Republican, but also those who are in the middle of those, because there are a lot of people also here that have, like, for example, Protestant and Catholic parents, in which are in the middle, and they don't feel like they have a voice for that. And their voice is also something that matters in the demographic, in what we just voted to show our opinion. And I am wondering if there is any possibility for the government to install educational practices that not only try to amend wrongdoings from the past, but actively working on how can we give the future generation the necessary tools in order to move on from the agree to disagree, to move on from the state that has been held in place for 25 years. That.
I was just wondering, I've an open mind on the matter of a border poll, but as somebody of a certain age, I just wonder, is there any indication at this stage of what the situation would be regarding the state pension and the health service?
Suzanne?
I haven't heard any mention of it, but
Well,
it seems quite relevant.
Yeah. And I'm sure it'll be asked lots. In terms of benefits, I think just generally they are higher in the Irish Republic than they are here. Certainly unemployment benefit is. In terms of the NHS, I think that is something, if when the executive is restored, I think that if unionists get a chance, they should take the health ministry and try and really reform the NHS, because the NHS used to be such a big selling point for the union, and it isn't anymore. The health service here is significantly worse than the one that there is in Britain, and also, I would argue, in the Republic. So I think, rather than fussing around details of the protocol, I think sensible, smart unionists would be doing something about redressing that, and making the NHS trying to return it to the excellent service it once was, because it's practical questions like that. There are some people who obviously will be motivated from their heart and their passions and what they believe, but there'll be other people thinking about the pounds and pennies in their pocket, and also the type of health care they will receive when they need it.
For those of us who are now retired, all our taxes will have been paid into the UK government. Are the UK government just going to write a cheque to the Southern government to pay for our pensions and bring us into their health service down there?
I suspect that will be the case, that if there was to be a united Ireland, that the British government would end up writing the cheque, yeah.
I just want to say, in terms of grassroots communities, the Good Friday Agreement, yes, while it was a thing of managing conflict and all that sort of thing, I work on the Imagine Peace Wall project, which is working with both sides of the community. And while at the time the Good Friday Agreement was maybe the right thing to do, like if you decide that, I think so. But right now, it's not really having a benefit for the grassroots community. People are suffering. Like, we work in the Lower Old Park. We're losing our nursery. There's no Stormont sitting. There's funds there to be handed out, and they're not getting it. So, yes, while people might have voted for the Good Friday Agreement, if it was to come back now, why should people go and do that? And also, it's us, the grassroots community, actually put the politicians in their place and expect them to fight for the grassroots community and everybody's rights, but that's not happening.
I think, and John has said this, that the Good Friday Agreement, in terms of being a peace deal, in terms of saving lives, it worked very well, and there are hundreds or thousands of people walking around today who wouldn't be if it hadn't have been approved. But as a political deal and in terms of building community relations and reconciliation, it actually has failed quite miserably, and there has been no economic dividend for the communities that you talk about. I mean, there's, now there's lots of tourists in Belfast. There's fancy restaurants, where people can go in and pay for £70 tasting menus. But for a lot of ordinary people, life has not changed, and that does represent a big, fat failure.
Our nursery in the Lower Old Park, the people of the community depend on that. It's a very vital service that we're providing there, and we have no idea whether that's going to continue, and until there's a government sitting, there's no funding to be released, and we are fully funded for the position, so we now could be losing staff members and things like that because of this. It's not fair.
Sorry, I think just give me a license to say something. Again, it's, I think, too, it's the Sure Starts that are under threat as well, and it's youth services, and those are all in the areas of lower socioeconomic range. And women, too, are suffering because the midwifery services are really very poor in the health service at the moment. If you are going in to give birth, there's a third to half of the midwives that are supposed to be on the shift that are actually on the shift, and that is a disaster waiting to happen. It's just, yeah.
All right, thanks very much. Thanks for all your questions. I think we've given them enough. I might have lied before when I said it was the last question, though, because I am going to ask you to give me your views on how you think tonight has went. So one last. If you rate it from so 1 to 5, 1 is very good, 2 good, 3 poor, 4 average, that should be the other one, and 5 is very poor. And one last thing, can you please, on your way out, please remember to drop off your voting pads just by the desk. All right, and thanks very much, everyone.